conclude with a call to live philosophically, facing adversity with calm dignity. In the shadow of empire, where the whims of a mad ruler cast long and bloody trails across the annals of time, there stands a figure of unyielding resolve, a thinker compelled to confront the ultimate decree. Imagine the scene, the bath prepared, veins opened in deliberate ritual, not in despair, but in quiet command of one's destiny. This is no mere end, my friends, but a profound testament to the sovereignty of the soul over the frailties of flesh. Nero, that tempest of excess and cruelty, believed he could silence wisdom with a command, yet in that very act, he unwittingly amplified its eternal echo. The Rome of Nero was not merely a city, it was a fevered dream made marble and gold, a place where the air itself seemed thick with incense, paranoia, and the metallic scent of blood. By the year 65, the emperor had already burned half the capital in a conflagration that many whispered he himself had ordered, strumming his lyre while the flames devoured the homes of the poor and the palaces of the proud alike. He had murdered his own mother Agrippina with a theatricality that would have shamed the stage, a collapsing boat, drowned sailors, poisoned figs. He had kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death in a fit of rage. Senators trembled at banquets, knowing a careless joke could mean crucifixion or the arena. Informers multiplied like flies on a corpse. The Senate itself had become a theater of cowardice, where men voted thanksgivings to the gods for the privilege of keeping their heads a little longer. Into this atmosphere of suffocating dread stepped a man whose very existence constituted an act of rebellion simply by being unafraid. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, tutor to the young Nero, former consul, the empire's most celebrated philosopher, had watched his former pupil descend into a monster. Once he had hoped to shape the boy into an enlightened ruler, now he saw only a spoiled god-king who believed the world existed for his amusement. Seneca had already withdrawn from court as much as a man in his position could, retiring to his villas, writing essays on tranquility and the brevity of life, trying to practice the detachment he preached. But withdrawal was itself a political statement in a regime that demanded sycophancy as proof of loyalty. To step back was to imply that the center itself was rotten. Then came the pisonian conspiracy, a sprawling, half-hearted plot involving senators, prefects, poets, and soldiers who dreamed of replacing Nero with the mild-mannered Calpurnius Piso. It was discovered almost before it began, betrayed, as such plots always are, by fear and ambition. Nero's vengeance was immediate and spectacular. Executions followed one after another, the poet Lucan forced to open his veins while reciting his own verses, the conspirators' wives and children dragged into the nightmare, whole households erased. The emperor, drunk on power and terror, saw enemies everywhere. And among the names that surfaced, whether through genuine involvement or the convenient lie of an informer, was Seneca's. The philosopher was at one of his country estates when the centurion arrived with Nero's order, "Take your own life." The charge was treason, the sentence irrevocable. In that moment the entire machinery of imperial tyranny revealed itself in crystalline clarity. Here was a man who had spent decades teaching that the only true freedom lies within, that external circumstances cannot touch the disciplined mind, now given the ultimate opportunity to demonstrate the truth of his doctrine before the eyes of history. Nero did not merely want Seneca dead, he wanted him humiliated, broken, made an example. The forced suicide was itself a ritual of domination. The victim must cooperate in his own destruction, must acknowledge the emperor's absolute power even over life and death. It was meant to be a public admission that no amount of wealth, no depth of wisdom, no past service could protect a man from the imperial whim. The great Stoic who had lectured the world on contempt for death was to be compelled to prove it under the most degrading circumstances imaginable. Yet precisely because the order came from Nero, because it embodied the arbitrary cruelty of a regime that murdered virtue whenever it threatened to expose vice, Seneca's acceptance transformed the act from submission into the most powerful repudiation possible. By choosing to die calmly, deliberately, on his own terms within the narrow space allowed him, he stripped the tyrant of the spectacle he craved. Where Nero sought terror, Seneca offered serenity. Where the emperor demanded fear, the philosopher gave instruction. The very method chosen, opening the veins in a warm bath, echoed the deaths of earlier martyrs for principle, from Socrates drinking hemlock to Cato falling on his sword at Utica. In a city that had grown accustomed to watching men beg, bribe, or betray to save their skins, here was someone who greeted the messenger of death as an old acquaintance. This confrontation between naked power and unarmed wisdom crystallizes everything that was monstrous about Nero's rule and everything that remains immortal about the human spirit's refusal to be finally enslaved. The emperor commanded armies, palaces, the adoration of millions. The philosopher possessed nothing but the coherence of his life and thought. Yet in that final confrontation it was the thinker who emerged the freer man, proving that when tyranny demands the body, a disciplined soul can still answer, "Take it, for you never owned what mattered." The blood that flowed into the bathwater that day was not merely the end of a life, it was the indelible signature of intellectual freedom written across the face of oppression, a signature that no amount of imperial purple could ever blot out or silence. The centurion delivered the sentence with the flat finality of a man who had carried too many such messages. The philosopher was to die by his own hand, at once, and in the Roman way. No soldier's blade would sully imperial dignity, the victim himself must perform the execution. A bath was ordered heated, servants dismissed, the doors closed. What followed was not a hurried suicide but a ceremony as deliberate and composed as any sacrifice at an altar, a ritual conducted in two elements only, blood and silence. First the blood. The veins of both arms were opened with a small, precise knife. Seneca was 69, the arteries hardened by age, the flow sluggish. When the crimson threads proved too slow, the veins of the legs were cut as well. Still the life clung stubbornly. Poison was brought, hemlock, the same draught that had carried Socrates away centuries before, and swallowed without hesitation. Yet even the poison moved languidly in that exhausted body. Finally, to hasten the end, he entered the steaming bath, and the water itself turned the color of diluted wine. This was no random spilling. Every drop was intentional, measured, offered. Blood, to the Roman mind, was the visible signature of life itself, the warm river that carried heat, courage, the very soul through the limbs. When a general sacrificed before battle, he studied the flow of the victim's blood for omens. When a gladiator fell, the crowd leaned forward to see how richly the sand drank. Blood was currency, proof, and prophecy. By releasing his own in steady, unhurried pulses, Seneca transformed the enforced punishment into a libation. He was not being bled like a criminal in the arena for the amusement of the mob, he was pouring out the last of his mortal substance as a deliberate gift to the truth he had served. The bathwater became an altar, the steam a veil of incense, the slow reddening of the surface the only hymn required. And then the silence. There were no screams, no curses hurled at the absent emperor, no theatrical laments for posterity. Friends and disciples stood around the room. His wife Paulina had tried to die with him and been forcibly saved on Nero's orders, but the dying man spoke quietly, almost conversationally, dictating final thoughts to the secretaries who wept as they wrote. When the power of speech began to fail, he switched to wax tablets, continuing the work of philosophy even as the letters grew faint. Witnesses later remembered not an outcry but an overwhelming stillness, broken only by the soft drip of water and blood, the scratch of the stylus, the labored breathing that gradually shallowned. That silence was louder than any protest could have been. In a city where men purchased a few more hours by denouncing their children, where senators groveled in verse to praise the emperor's mediocre singing, where the nights rang with the forced merriment of compulsory banquets, this refusal to make a spectacle was itself a thunderous denunciation. Nero wanted noise, the sound of a great mind cracking, the satisfying crash of a reputation shattered. Instead he received a hush so complete that it echoed down the centuries. The tyrant could command the body to bleed, but he could not compel the soul to cry out. In the midst of an empire built on acclamation and terror, one man demonstrated that the ultimate sovereignty belongs to the disciplined spirit that can meet death without adding a single unnecessary sound to the world. The ritual, then, was a perfect inversion. Where imperial power sought to reduce a human being to raw, suffering flesh, the philosopher responded by elevating flesh into symbol. Blood ceased to be evidence of the emperor's reach and became instead the ink in which an indestructible sentence was written. No external force can conquer the governed mind. Silence ceased to be the absence of defense and became the presence of absolute mastery. Together, blood and silence composed a ceremony more solemn than any triumph Nero ever staged on the Via Sacra, a rite that consecrated not the power of the princeps but the older, deeper authority of conscience. In that small, steam-filled room, far from the roar of the circus and the applause of sycophants, the elements themselves seemed to pause and take instruction. The water accepted the offering and turned it sacred, the air grew heavy with the dignity of a life coherently concluded. What began as the ultimate assertion of tyrannical control ended as the quietest, most devastating declaration of freedom ever enacted within the borders of Rome. The blood cooled, the silence deepened, and the lesson was sealed forever in both. The scene is almost unbearably intimate, an old man in a copper tub, arms and legs open like pale flowers, the water around him slowly turning the color of garnets while friends stand helpless and the steam carries away the last warmth of a life. Yet if we linger only on the pathos we miss the deeper music. This is not tragedy in the ordinary sense, it is the final, flawless cadence of a philosophical symphony played without a single false note from cradle to grave. Every drop of blood, every withheld cry, is a restatement of themes announced decades earlier in the quiet study at Corduba, repeated in the villas of exile, refined in the forced leisure of Nero's court, and now brought to perfect resolution in the hush of a country bathroom. Mortality, virtue, the sovereignty of the inner citadel, these were not abstract topics for Seneca, they were the very architecture of a life, and death was simply the portico through which one walked when the building was complete. Mortality first. From his earliest essays Seneca had insisted that the only way to master life is to keep death daily before the eyes. Every day, he wrote, we should rehearse dying. Most men, he observed, live as if they have infinite tomorrows, squandering hours on ambition, resentment, pleasure, only to be ambushed by the end. The wise, by contrast, live each sunrise already posthumous, free from the terror that makes cowards of us all. When the centurion arrived, therefore, Seneca did not discover death, he recognized an old companion who had sat at every dinner, walked beside him in every garden, waited patiently while he corrected proofs of the moral letters. The shock that would have shattered another man was, for him, the quiet closing of a long open parenthesis. The blood in the bathwater was merely the visible punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he had been composing since youth. Virtue next, and here the drama deepens. Roman virtue had always been public, noisy, inseparable from the applause of the forum, the general on his triumph, the orator swaying the centuries, the paterfamilias whose dignitas held provinces in awe. Seneca's entire career had been an argument against that equation. True virtue, he taught, is internal, indifferent to audience, rewarded only by its own coherence. The courtier who flattered Nero, the senator who voted divine honors for a matricide, the millionaire who built ever larger villas, all were slaves because their happiness depended on external approval. The man who orders his soul according to reason, however, is king though he wear chains. In the moment the death order arrived, the entire preceding life flashed into focus as proof. Every compromise Seneca had made, and he had made many, the forced loans, the tactful silences, the vast fortune whose origins he could never fully reconcile with Stoic simplicity, now stood revealed as prologue to this final, uncompromising act. By dying exactly as he had taught, he redeemed every earlier inconsistency. The blood was not only life leaving the body, it was the last impurity being refined away, leaving the pure metal of a consistent doctrine. And finally the mind's triumph over the body, the oldest Stoic anthem now sung in a minor key that somehow sounds more triumphant than any major. The body, for all its loyal service, had always been a temporary domicile, a beast of burden to be fed, groomed, and when necessary disciplined. In the bath it betrayed him one last time, veins too narrow, blood too thick, poison too slow. Most men would have raged at the indignity of a death that refused to be quick. Seneca greeted the betrayal with the same equanimity he had recommended when ships founder or fortunes collapse. The body's failure became the final laboratory demonstration. Look, even when every nerve screams and the lungs burn for air, the judging mind can remain apart, observant, almost amused. He continued dictating moral reflections while his tongue thickened, switched to tablets when speech failed, and when even the hand faltered he still shaped thoughts that secretaries could read. The flesh dissolved, but the logos endured, luminous and unperturbed, proving once and for all that the essential self is not the beating heart or the seeing eye but the calm intelligence that watches both expire. In that slow bleeding out, therefore, every great Stoic theme found its definitive illustration. Mortality was not an intruder but an invited guest who arrived precisely on schedule. Virtue was not the applause of the circus but the quiet coherence felt by a mind that has kept faith with itself. The body, that faithful, treacherous servant, was dismissed with neither gratitude nor resentment, simply released from a contract honorably fulfilled. What looked from the outside like the ultimate defeat, the forced suicide of a disgraced minister, was, from the inside, the most complete victory a human being can achieve, a life so thoroughly examined, so deliberately shaped, that death itself became merely the last chapter written in the same steady hand as all the others. The water cooled, the friends wept, the empire moved on to its next horror, but the theme Seneca had sounded across 4 decades of writing now rang out with a clarity no future tyranny could ever again obscure. The centurion expected resistance. Every previous messenger sent on such errands had faced the full theater of human desperation, men offering half their fortunes, others collapsing in tears, a few lunging for hidden daggers in futile rebellion. The officer had been instructed to use force if necessary. Nero wanted no embarrassing delays. Instead he found an old man who rose from his desk with the courteous gravity one shows when receiving a long-awaited guest. At last, Seneca is said to have remarked, almost cheerfully, as though the soldier had come to announce dinner. That single moment contains the entire revolution. What the tyrant intended as the ultimate proof of subjection became, in the philosopher's hands, the purest assertion of agency possible to a mortal creature. There is a terrible genius in the Roman penalty of forced suicide. It strips away every refuge. Flight is impossible, the house is surrounded. Appeal is useless, the sentence is signed. Even violent resistance is denied, because the guards stand ready to bind and bleed the victim themselves if he will not cooperate, turning proud death into mere slaughter. The condemned man is left with one narrow aperture of freedom, the manner in which he performs the act that has already been decided for him. Most discover too late that the aperture is an illusion. Panic, rage, or despair rush in and fill the space. Seneca stepped through it as calmly as a priest entering the sanctuary he has served all his life. He asked for tablets to amend his will, an absurd request, since everything would be confiscated anyway, but the gesture itself was deliberate. Even now he would behave as though the ordinary rules of civitas still applied, as though Rome were still a republic of laws and not a slaughterhouse wearing purple. When the request was refused he smiled, turned to his weeping friends, and began dictating the final pages of what we now call his last testament. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. They had expected screams, not a seminar. Time, which Nero meant to make an instrument of torment, was quietly reclaimed and spent on the only coin that cannot be confiscated, coherent thought offered to posterity. Then came the choice of method. He could have swallowed poison at once, or slashed his throat for speed, or simply sat in sullen silence until the guards grew impatient and finished the job. Each option would have granted the emperor a partial victory. Haste would have looked like fear, violence like anger, passivity like brokenness. Instead he chose the slow, traditional opening of the veins in warm water, the very ritual Cato had used to defy Caesar a century earlier. By adopting the death of the great Republican martyr he placed himself in direct lineage, wordlessly declaring that the same spirit which once resisted dictatorship still walked the earth, and that Nero, for all his divinity, was merely the latest in a line of tyrants destined to be judged by the unbending measure of principle. Even the body's stubborn refusal to die quickly, the sluggish blood, the ineffective hemlock, became another occasion for mastery. Where another man would have cursed the pain or begged for a quicker end, Seneca treated the delay as an unexpected gift of extra hours to finish his teaching. Friends recorded that he joked gently about the slowness of Greek poison in Roman veins, as though commenting on a mildly disappointing vintage. The soldiers, trained to see every delay as potential trouble, found themselves involuntary witnesses to a performance of composure so absolute that it rendered their swords irrelevant. The power they carried in their scabbards had been made suddenly childish by a naked old man bleeding serenely into bathwater. Paulina, his young wife, insisted on dying with him. When the centurion, on Nero's orders, had her wrists bound to stop the flow, Seneca neither protested nor despaired. He simply noted that he had been granted the rare privilege of seeing conjugal devotion survive even the emperor's veto. The moment could have been one of shattering defeat, his last companion torn away, his final wish overruled, yet he transformed it into quiet triumph. Love itself had defied the tyrant, and would continue to do so long after both their hearts stopped. Every gesture, then, was a deliberate seizure of initiative within the cage of compulsion. The tyrant had scripted the plot, traitor, sentence, blood. The philosopher rewrote the meaning without altering a single stage direction. Where Nero wrote humiliation, Seneca wrote ratification. Where the emperor wrote terror, the dying man wrote curriculum. The same physical events, the knife, the bath, the crimson water, that were meant to inscribe imperial dominion upon a human body became instead the medium through which a free soul signed its own Declaration of Independence. The act that was designed to prove that no one, not even the empire's greatest mind, could stand outside the reach of arbitrary power became the most convincing possible proof that one narrow, luminous space always remains inviolable, the space in which a person decides what the act shall signify. In the end the centurion rode back to Rome carrying not the satisfying report of a broken spirit but the unsettling news that the condemned man had somehow managed to die as though the choice had been entirely his own. The empire had taken everything, wealth, honors, breath, yet the essential possession had slipped through its fingers like smoke. The ritual meant to crush resistance had instead consecrated it, and the blood that was supposed to wash away the last traces of dignity left only a brighter, more indelible stain. Seneca did not merely endure fate, he embraced it so completely that fate itself was changed in the embrace, converted from execution into apotheosis, from punishment into the final, irrefutable proof that a human being can remain sovereign even while the heart forgets its rhythm and the light fades from the eyes. Walk into any forum of the modern world and you will hear the same anxious chorus that echoed through Nero's Rome. The system is too powerful, the surveillance too complete, the consequences too swift. One careless sentence, one viral post, one refusal to applaud the latest orthodoxy, and careers end, reputations bleed out, families are shunned. The methods have changed. No centurion now kicks down the door at dawn, yet the psychology is identical. Fear masquerades as prudence, silence is rebranded as responsibility, and millions teach themselves to live half alive rather than risk the emperor's displeasure. In that atmosphere the story of a man who opened his veins in a warm bath 2,000 years ago ceases to be ancient history and becomes instead an urgent dispatch from the only battlefield that ultimately matters. Look closely at what actually happened in that small room outside Rome. A single human being, stripped of every external defense, no legions, no fortune left to bribe with, no public voice remaining, confronted the concentrated might of the world's greatest empire and refused to grant it the tribute it demanded most, fear. The empire wanted terror as tax, he paid in tranquility. It wanted shame, he answered with coherence. It wanted the spectacle of a great mind crumbling, he gave the spectacle of a quiet evening among friends, death treated as minor punctuation in an ongoing conversation. That refusal is not locked in the past, it is a capability still nestled inside every chest that beats. The room may be a corporate office, a university corridor, a darkened apartment lit only by the glow of a screen, but the choice remains identical: cooperate in your own diminishment or decline the invitation. We are told endlessly that courage belongs to another age, that the stakes today are too complex, the powers too diffuse, the punishments too sophisticated for old-fashioned defiance. Yet every time someone speaks the truth they were warned not to speak, every time a parent refuses to let a child be medically altered for ideological conformity, every time an artist releases work that will cost them galleries and grants, the bathwater turns crimson again and the same lesson is retaught: the space between stimulus and response is still sovereign territory. No regime, no algorithm, no mob has ever managed to colonize that narrow ground. They can take the body, the job, the platform, the friends. What they cannot take is the meaning you assign to their taking. Seneca's blood was not shed to purchase some distant political outcome. Rome did not become a republic again because one philosopher died well. The blood was shed to keep open a door that tyranny is forever trying to brick up, the door through which a human being walks out of mere survival and into actual life. Every generation imagines its own version of that bricked-up doorway: confession in Stalin's cellar, the struggle session, the public apology video, the quiet decision to look away so the mortgage can be paid, and every generation discovers, if it dares to look, that the bricks are only mortar deep. Behind them stands the same small, steaming room, the same unbearable choice, the same unbearable freedom. Live philosophically, then, does not mean retreating to a library and annotating texts. It means practicing, daily and deliberately, the muscle that Seneca flexed once and for all in the presence of armed men, the muscle that says, you may determine the external circumstances, but I still decide what this event shall signify. Practice it in miniature, refusing to laugh at the cruel joke, declining to signal the approved enthusiasm, choosing the truthful word even when the polite lie would be frictionless, and the muscle grows. One day the centurion arrives, by email, by subpoena, by midnight knock, and the muscle is ready. The bath is heated, the knife is offered, and instead of discovering that you have lived as a stranger to yourself, you recognize the moment as the final examination you have been preparing for since the first time you chose integrity over convenience. That is the call sounding across 20 centuries, not to romantic revolution, not to feudal gestures, but to the steady, unspectacular discipline of living as though the inner citadel actually exists, because it does, and no empire has ever stormed it without the collaboration of its rightful sovereign. Keep the walls in repair. Furnish the rooms with examined beliefs, honorable loves, unperformed vanities laid aside. Then, when the messenger comes, and he always comes, the door opens from within, the guest is received with composure, and the empire, for one luminous instant, is forced to confront the unnerving truth that its power ends exactly where a human being calmly decides it must end. The water is still there, waiting. The choice is still ours. The silence, when it finally falls, will speak with the same undefeated accent it spoke in a villa outside Rome on an April evening long ago, telling every tyrant who ever lived or ever will live that the soul, properly tended, remains forever beyond the reach of chains.